Hey there. Okay, so let's talk about what we talk about when we talk about God by Rob Bell. So I discovered him fairly recently, and I just love it. I want to go farther than he goes in a lot of ways, but I just really love, the couple of books that I read by him. I read this one, obviously, and then What is the Bible? I read that one. Which a whole bunch of that was kind of what I know as a theology student, but then I love a couple pieces that I hadn't heard, and just it was a refreshing, especially to hear him explaining it that way, because I think people need that, especially people who want to know about Christianity and Christians and the Bible, who are asking those questions. How does the Bible fit into our modern world? Like, how do we as modern people make sense of the Bible? Like, he talks about it so well. Yeah, but we'll focus on this book for right now. He does a great job in that one about just talking about how the Bible is a book of history and people having a religious experience and God working in them at that point in time, and how the Bible is from their perspective and their experience. And then he brings in a bunch of Jewish tradition that helps us to understand the context, which is just always super important. Okay, so in this book, what we talk about when we talk about God, I love this book as a fairly short, concise introduction to this conversation of talking about God. And I think he does a really, really incredible job of just capturing the essence of, like, let's talk about God. Let's talk about spiritual stuff. He's a pastor, so he comes from a Christian perspective, which is different than a lot of books that I've been reading recently. I haven't been reading that because I know all that, but I needed more, so I've been hungry for other stuff. But it's been really interesting and refreshing to see the way he talks about it. And so first, I just kind of want to introduce his outline for the book, which is also really fun. First, to introduce the concept, he talks about... He mentions Jane Fonda and how when she was drawn to faith, she said it was because I could feel reverence humming in me. And he's like, yeah, that's a good way to say that. Like, that reverence that's humming in us, like, just, the idea of talking about that feeling, like, we have that feeling. We all know that, so let's talk about that. What does that mean? And he uses that to introduce it. And then his outline for the book is, at first, he talks about being open, and he says, first, we'll talk about being open because when we talk about God, we drag a massive amount of expectations and assumptions into the discussion with us about how the world works and what kind of universe we're living in. Often God's existence is challenged in the conversation about what matters most in the modern world, because haven't we moved past all of that ancient, primitive, superstitious thinking? We have science and religion and logic. What does God have to do with our challenges now? And he says, quite a lot, actually, because the universe, it turns out, is way, way weirder than any of us first thought. And so he's like, we need to start by that weirdness will demand that we be open. So he goes into this whole first section of the book, which I just loved. One of the books we're going to do soon, I need to order it because I just have it on Kindle, and I really need these for doing this with you guys. I need the physical book. I need to, underline it and flip through it and write on my note cards, right? Or I've got my note cards that I need to fill in, so I've got my key concepts from the book so I can write the summary document. Anyways, The Field is one that I want to talk about soon because she takes a journalist approach and kind of just gives a summary. She does the research and talks about a bunch of different scientists and what, in their little area of science, what all these different people have discovered and what they've been working on, and how it all contributes to this general idea that at its smallest, tiniest piece, everything that we think of as matter, if you go down small enough, it's actually energy. So matter is just slowed down energy. And energy has the potential to be matter has the potential to be energy. Anyways, but everything is actually made up of energy, and it's all connected in this crazy weird quantum physics way that totally doesn't work with our Newtonian view of the world. But in that book, The Field, I forget the subtitle, but Lynn McTaggart, she is just like, you know, scientists might be like, what? But the spiritual people are just like, yes, this totally, like, yes. And I was just like, yes, I know what she's saying, because I read it and I'm just like, the things that I knew that are true. And I read somebody saying like, yeah, well, we used to just have faith and whatever, and we just thought whatever was true, and then science proved that. So science is slowly catching up, or slowly, I don't know. Science is, you know, doing its thing and catching up to some things that we just know intuitively. But the point is that when Rob Bell, in this book, I've been on this whole journey pulling together bits and pieces of the science and stuff, and then I just found he has this, like, I mean, it's small and rough, but it's like this wonderful, beautiful summary that he gives in this chapter called Open about just the strangeness of the universe and the stuff that we're discovering with science. He says, your chair is ultimately a relationship of energy. This clear distinction between the material world and the immaterial world, between the physical and the world and the spiritual world. We're learning from science that that distinction isn't so clear after all. In other words, the line between matter and spirit may not be a line at all. The primary essence of reality is energy flow. And I'm like, yes, all of this that I've been reading from these different places, he like summarizes it all in just this beautiful, and I love the way he writes. I want to like reread this because I want to incorporate some of this style when I write my book. So he talks about energy, and then, you know, talks about how everything is energy, which I think is the same as spirit, which I think is a whole concept I want to explore, like energy equals spirit. Because it kind of in like the mystical woo-woo, whatever, like people talk about energy, and like energy to me was this like fresh terminology that was just incredibly enlightening. And I'm all about energy now. I'm just like, oh, that's so fascinating. But then, like, so much of me, like, my worldview, my everything that I know, my history, my historical understanding of things is the Holy Spirit, and spiritual stuff is spirit, right? Well, I think spirit equals energy. And I think mixing the two and talking about one and then the other, using that equation, could really unlock even more just helpful ways to talk about this. And I love the way we'll get to that in a second, with both. He talks about how language is helpful and yet almost also fails us sometimes. Anyways, so as far as, I'm going to go on with my like summary of the book to introduce it, right? So he talks about being open, so he talks about science and how weird the universe is, and how, you know, that affects the way we think about spirituality and God, because our concept of the universe needs to get bigger. And yeah, I won't even get into evolution, but evolution was this thing that was just like a catalyst for my loss of faith, and then rebuilding a much bigger, much deeper, stronger faith. And now I look at it and I'm just like, evolution is, well, like once you get past that block, evolution is beautiful. Like, it's just beautiful. The fact that, like, that is the mechanism, and that is, like, our way to see God, who is spirit, who is energy, who is literally in everything and does make up everything. I wonder if I could find the way he says it here. He says, oh crap, I'll have to find it. He says something about how Genesis is a, anyways, the way that Genesis is a poem about the Big Bang of, crap, now I see, this is why I need to have my cards before I do this. Oh, here we go. His point is that here we go. Okay, he says in Philippi, we're just gonna go here. Okay, in Philippians, Paul is writing to the church in Philippi, and he says that the God who began a good work in them will be sure and certain to complete it. And so Rob Bell is saying, hey, that's really cool. They would have known that those words in, you know, in that language are used in the same order in Genesis, they're used in that same order in the Genesis creation poem that begins the Bible, a poem about a massive bang that brought the world into being, bristling with explosive creative potential and possibility. So he says that Paul's point is that the same creative bang that formed the universe is unleashed in us through our trust in what God is doing in the world through Jesus. His insistence is that this extraordinary energy in all its diverse and expansive forms is deeply personal and readily available and on our side. And that is just astounding. It's just incredible when you get into science and you think about, I've been watching like science documentaries with my kids on Netflix, and just, you know, how old the world is, and then how even the dinosaurs became extinct in order for humans to be able to evolve, and even our evolution. And you get into just, well, he talks about it, about what God teaches them in the Old Testament and then through the New Testament. And then I think in recent stuff, just progressive revelation as God is guiding our human evolution. Anyways, super off. Okay, so open, right? Just he's like, we need to be open. Science is helping us see how weird and incredible and mysterious, and I think beautiful, science is, and the world is, and everything that is the world at its smallest point is energy, which I think is the same as spirit. So God literally is the divine force and presence that sustains and is in everything, and it's all connected. Anyways, so back to our introduction to the book. He talks about open, and then he talks about both, and he says, then we'll talk about talking, because when we talk about God, we're using language, and language both helps us and fails us in our attempts to understand and describe the paradoxical nature of the God who is beyond words. So he has this really fun section where he talks about language and the way we use language, and even, you know, when we talk about being over the moon, or you know, just the times that that we use these, like, I don't know where it is. We use these different expressions that aren't really what they really mean, but we're just, language is failing us, and we're trying to find, you know, words and expressions and phrases to, like, say what we're trying to say. And so he's just like, sometimes we use language and it really helps, and then sometimes language fails us. So he's like, language is both helpful and yet not enough. And then he talks about how God is with us, which I love, which I was just talking about that in the video before this one. So yeah, I'll do a video about that one. But basically, God is with us. He's with us. He's not just somewhere else and then, like, pops in to see what's going on. Like, God is abiding with us. He is here. And the chapter after that one is about how God is for us, right? And then I love this one where he's like, God is ahead of us. And he's just like, there's this, he talks about, so good, he's brilliant. He talks about the misconception that, like, God is behind and is, like, antiquated, and, like, because the Old Testament is historical and old, and the examples of, like, what's happening in the Old Testament is, like, sometimes even barbaric, right? But just, like, so back there to us. But he talks about how what God is doing with God's people in the Old Testament was ahead of its time. And then what Jesus talks about in the New Testament, what God is doing there, is ahead of its time. And he talks about how what God is doing today in believers' lives, like in the spirit-filled, energy-filled, whatever, like people who are with God, what God is doing in our lives is ahead of the times. But then, I'm not going to try to find it, but he talks about how, you know, the religious institutions of our time, they can become, if they don't stay with God and what God is doing, which is challenging, it's easy to slip into the status quo. If the religious institutions do not stay with what God is doing, they will become behind and fall behind the times of how the Spirit of God is moving, and then they will make some people think that God is behind, but God is not. God is always, and I love the way he illustrates that in that chapter, the way he talks about it. God is always ahead of us. God is always pulling us. He's pulling us toward our collective potential. And then he goes into so, and so he's like, so what do we do about it next? There's a fun introductory video. Get excited for, I don't know how many I'm doing this time, but there will be at least another one. So I will see you in the next video.